This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at BakerStreetIrregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the stockbroker clerked, Lady Frances Carfax disappeared, and Bruce Partington planned, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever wondered what a commissionaire does? Or what a compositor is? Or of the difference between a stevedore and a stoker?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 256, Romance in the Canon. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we talk about the minutiae in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you ready? You ready for a little romance?
I am ready for romance. Boy, you know, the lights are down low. I've got the candles lit. And I'm wearing my velvet smoking jacket, but I also see I've got on my blue sneakers, so I've got to change something.
That took a decidedly unromantic turn, Bert.
Yeah. And no socks. That's not going to work.
Spoiler alert, yeah. Well, before we get all Barry White on you here, just a brief reminder that you can find the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/trifles256. That's all lowercase. It'll take you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com site, where you can find all kinds of information about us, how to support the show, where we are on the socials, how to contact us via email. It's all there for your taking, and it's free. Now, if you'd like to make it not free, which we encourage, we have a Patreon page, and you can reach it from the show notes as well. For as little as $1 a month, you can help us continue to bring these shows to you and to other Sherlockians worldwide. Well, romance in the canon. You know, Sherlock Holmes famously said that he accused Watson of taking what could have been a series of scientific exercises and turning them into a series of romantic tales, much like putting a romantic twist into the fifth proposition of Euclid. And yet, the romance is there in a number of ways. And I know we just wanted to pick out a handful of stories to demonstrate some of the romance in the canon.
Yes, well said. You know, and we've touched upon this before in the past. Back in September, we had an episode of Trifles towards the end of the month called Plotting Lovers, where we looked at Abbey Grange and Thor Bridge and what about the star-crossed lovers. But one of the things, and it's a continuing theme in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, because one of the reasons why the canon has endured since the 19th century is because it touches on these human areas. You know, these people lived in our minds in the cases of Sherlock Holmes because, you know, they all had, many of them, let's put it this way, had concerns that we could all relate to. And romance, you know, romance and love is one of these themes that continually works through the canon. So today, you know, we thought we would take a look at, quickly step through 3 or 4 stories where romance is really prominent. You know, a good place to start, I suppose, is Scandal in Bohemia. And the interesting thing about Scandal in Bohemia, one of the many interesting things, is thinking about it from the perspective of Sherlock Holmes. Who does Holmes admire? You know, Holmes typically becomes engaged with these prospects, with these cases, with these puzzles that he's trying to sort through because of a client. But in this case, Holmes does not admire or even is particularly on the side of his client. Here he is really on the side of the person who's been loved and discarded. And I think that's a recurring theme about his perspective in his cases.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting observation, because this is the very first short story in which we encounter Sherlock Holmes. And, this was Conan Doyle's debut in the Strand magazine. And here we have Holmes being greeted by royalty. The King of Bohemia shows up at Baker Street now, albeit in a black mask and disguise and whatnot. But it was clear from Holmes's interaction with him that he didn't take well to the officiousness and the almost the privilege with which the king arrived, and as if to make all of his problems go away. That's what Sherlock Holmes was for. So right off the bat, he could see that there was a woman who had been used and discarded by the king. And she wasn't entirely innocent in all of this either. But Holmes tended to take the side of the individual to whom more harm seemingly had been done.
Yeah, the person who, has been treated poorly, and oftentimes in the cases of Sherlock Holmes, it's a woman, but not always. And so you could turn to the Three Gables. It's another really interesting case. Of course, it's later in the career of Sherlock Holmes, but Mrs. Maberly's poor son, Douglas, has died heartbroken because Isadora Klein loved him and left him. And the motivation in this case is he's left behind the manuscript telling the whole story. And that's very inconvenient for Isadora Klein.
Yeah, and it's clear she had a torrid affair with this young man. This could have been an episode of Cougar Town on Bravo or whatever network it's on. But there is some sympathy that we can have with Isadora Klein as well. I mean, this was clearly a major affair for her. Maberly was seriously affected by the breakup. She must have come to her wisdom and said, this can't go on indefinitely. Reality awaits, and broke it off. But she had him beaten under her window, maybe as he was serenading her or pleading with her, Cyrano de Bergerac back in the bushes there. So she humiliated him. And you have to wonder, how sour the romance had gone at that point for her to take those kinds of steps. And maybe how much off the deep end Douglas Maberly had gone. A man who clearly was being ruled by his heart rather than his head, because there couldn't have been a practical way for him to see through how this relationship would play out either.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, because, there is this parallel in Isadora Klein to Baron Gruner. She's someone who is using she's not nearly as evil a creature as Baron Gruner, but she's clearly using the soft emotions. She's using something wonderful, which is love, for personal gain and improving her lot in life. In fact, she's about to marry a young nobleman, and that's why we go through all of this with this manuscript.
Right. But it's almost like a lyric right out of the Eurythmics, Sweet Dreams. Some of them want to use you, some of them want to get used by you, some of them want to abuse you, some of them want to be abused.
Well, I didn't even know they were fans of Sherlock Holmes, but you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Well, we are fans of our sponsors here, and that's why we need to take a quick break for this word. In 2021, the BSI Press features 3 new volumes. That's right, 3 volumes, including one from the manuscript series, one from the professions series, and one dedicated to the outgoing head of the BSI. First, the manuscript series, you'll hear about the Staunton tragedy, that is, the missing three-quarter. Mike Whalen, the former head of the BSI, has edited this book, in which a number of authors take aim at the missing three-quarter. You'll learn about rugby, you'll learn about the mystery, you'll learn about, well, many things in the latest manuscript series. And in the latest Profession series, Michael Quigley and Marcia Pollock edit this volume that brings together corporals, colonels, and commissionaires as they look at military in the canon. And the third volume is A Quiet Air of Mastery, essays in honor of Mike Whalen as he steps down as the head of the Baker Street Irregulars. And that's edited by Les Klinger. All of these and more are available at BakerStreetIrregulars.com under the BSI Press section. Be sure to pick up your copy today. All right, we are getting all romantic here at Trifles. It is not Valentine's Day, but we thought, hey, there's turkey being served this week. That's romantic, right? No, it's because when people come over to your house, all the coats go on the bed.
Yeah, there you are. Well, there's a good deal of romance in bringing these families together, and there's also romance in the start of a family, and that's something we see in Sign of Four. And the lovely thing about thinking about Sign of Four after talking about the Three Gables and the scandal in Bohemia is that it's a novel, of course, and when you're faced with writing a novel, something significantly larger and more complex than a short story, you have to think about how to maintain the reader's interest. And one of the things I think that occurred to Conan Doyle was there really did need to be some sort of love interest in here. And he wasn't going to do that with his primary star, the detective Sherlock Holmes, who at this point he'd not conceived of as a character for a series of continuing short stories. So he turns to Watson. But we learn a lot about Holmes' experience and view of the relations between men and women, at least at this point, this very early point in Watson's association and our association with Holmes. When Watson falls in love with Mary Morstan, Holmes says, "I really cannot congratulate you. Women are never really to be trusted, not the best of them."
Oh, and there we have it. That's that ultimate beginning of Holmes's attitude toward women that colors so many of the essays, so many of the characterizations we see of Holmes over time. And, you know, he gives Watson his due. I mean, he says, you know, you've done well. And obviously, you know, he mentions not having noticed whether Mary Morstan was attractive or not, but, what's really interesting to me is by the time we get to the end of the Sign of Four, Watson kind of sums it all up, and he says, "The division seems rather unfair," I remarked. "You've done all the work in this business. I get a wife out of it. Jones gets the credit. Pray, what remains for you?" And This is interesting. The cynical automaton Holmes says, "For me, there still remains the cocaine bottle," and he stretched his long white hand up for it. So that's a wonderful tool that many authors use of kind of bookending, revisiting the opening scenes that we have in The Sign of Four at Baker Street, where Holmes gets scolded by Watson for the 7% solution.
Right. But there are some lovely things there, echoes back to Conan Doyle in Sign of Four. You know, for example, Watson describes Mary Morstan very convincingly, from her large blue eyes to her sweet age of 27. And Conan Doyle and his first wife, Louise Hawkins, who was known as Tui, were married in 1885. And Louise's age when they married was the same as Mary Morstan's, 27. And Watson calls Watson calls it a sweet age, and so clearly there's a lot of heart being put into these characters as Conan Doyle places them on the page.
Yeah, I had never picked up on that before, about the similarity of the ages. That's really interesting. And, it's also interesting to note that for Mary Morstan to be 27 and not yet married, that was old maid territory at that point,
Oh, yeah, that's true.
But God bless Watson. He clearly admired her, treasure or not. And she was a treasure to him.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so there you have it. The only other story we might just touch on for a second is Lion's Mane. And of course, we've talked recently about Maud Bellamy, who clearly got Holmes's attention. Now, the interesting thing is that at this point, I don't remember when Lion's Mane was written, but I'm presuming that it was written after Conan Doyle's first wife had passed on and he had married Jean Leckie. And how interesting to think that perhaps this very affectionate and striking description of Maud Bellamy might reflect Conan Doyle's own sense of Jean Leckie.
Yeah. Yeah, well, this was written in 1926, so this was toward the end of his life. But what a wonderful set piece, as it were, to honor his second wife and the romance that they had.
Yeah. And I think in fact, over the years, I think Julia Rosenblatt had written a paper suggesting, well, perhaps Holmes, who was 53 during the events of, about 53 in the event, when the events of Lion's Mane happened, perhaps Holmes actually went on to marry Maud Bellamy.
And then there's Maud. Well, that is certainly just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
You know my method. It is founded upon the observance of trifles.